Hello, friends. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Here, I share a brand new story every day. If you enjoy my videos, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's dive into today's story. One autumn afternoon, an elderly man entered a library, showing a card with his name on it, Mr. Richard Wallace, and asked if he could borrow a book. The name of the book I want is The Ancient Manuscript. It's number 41567, I believe, he said. But I don't know this library at all. Would someone be able to go and find it for me? A young man who worked there, Mr. Harris, was passing, and he answered, "Of course, I'll go and find it for you immediately, sir." Mr. Wallace sat down on a chair near the door to wait. When Mr. Harris returned, he had to apologize for failing to find the book. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Wallace, but someone has already borrowed that book." "Are you sure?" replied Mr. Wallace. "Yes, sir," said Harris. "But if you wait a moment, you'll probably meet the man who has taken it as he leaves the library. I didn't see him very well, but I think he was an elderly man, quite short, wearing a gray coat." "It's all right," said Mr. Wallace. "I won't wait now. Thank you. I have to go. But I'll come back again tomorrow, and perhaps you can find out who has the book." "Of course," replied Harris, and Wallace left the library quickly. Harris thought, "I'll just go back to that room and see if I can find the old man. I'll ask him if he can wait a few days for the book, and then I'll give it to Mr. Wallace tomorrow." So he went back to the same room, and when he got there, the book, the ancient manuscript, was back in the right place. Harris felt very bad. "Mr. Wallace hasn't got the book he wants," he said to himself, "because I didn't see it. I'll wait for him tomorrow and give him the book myself." The next morning, he was waiting for Mr. Wallace. "I'm very sorry," he said when Wallace came in, "but I was sure that the old man took the book away with him. If you'll wait for a moment, I'll run and get it for you now." Again, Wallace sat down and waited, but this time his wait was very long. After 20 minutes, he asked the woman behind the front desk if it was very far to the part of the library where Harris was looking for the book. "No, not far at all, sir," she answered. "It's odd that he's taking such a long time," and she went to look for Harris. She came back a few minutes later, looking rather worried. "I'm very sorry, sir, but something has happened to Mr. Harris," she said. "He suddenly became ill while he was looking for your book, and we have had to send him home." Mr. Wallace was surprised, but he answered politely, "I'm so sorry that Mr. Harris became ill while he was trying to help me. I'd very much like to go to his house to ask how he is. Could you give me his address?" The woman gave him the address, and before he left, Wallace asked her one last question. "Did you see an elderly man in a gray coat leaving the library soon after I was here yesterday afternoon?" "No, I didn't," replied the woman. "There were only 2 or 3 other men in here yesterday afternoon, and they were all quite young, I think." Mr. Wallace then left for Mr. Harris's house. He found him in a chair by the fire, looking pale and ill. "I'm so sorry for all the trouble I have caused you," Harris said. "Don't worry about it," said Wallace. "But what happened in that room? Did you fall? Did you see something?" "Well, yes, I did fall, and it was because I saw something," answered Harris. "It was just as I went into the room where we keep that book you want." "No, no," said Wallace hurriedly. "Don't tell me now. You will make yourself ill again." "But I'd like to tell someone," answered Harris. "Not now, young man, not now," said Wallace, standing up quickly. "I'm afraid I must go now," and he moved towards the door. Harris gave him the exact number of the book, the ancient manuscript, so that he could go to the library and find it himself the next day. But Wallace did not appear at the library again. Harris had another visitor later that day, Thomas Blake, who worked with him. Thomas said, "I'm sure there is something odd going on at the library, you know. When we found you on the floor, there was a terrible, strong smell in that room. It can't be good for people to work with a smell like that." Harris replied, "That smell isn't always there. I've only noticed it during the last few days. And it wasn't the smell that made me ill. It was something I saw. Let me tell you about it. I went into that room this morning to get a book for a man who was waiting downstairs, a Mr. Wallace. The afternoon before, I saw a short old man in gray take the same book out. But when I looked again, the book was there, back in its place. So this morning I went back to get it for Mr. Wallace, but the same old man in gray was there again. I looked more closely at him this time and saw that his skin was dry and brown and dusty. He had no hair at all. Horrible he was, really ugly. He was reading a book near the one I wanted, and when he turned around, I saw his face, and he had no eyes. It was a terrible shock. Everything suddenly seemed to go black inside my head, and I fell. I can't tell you anything more. Before Harris returned to work, his boss at the library told him to take a week off, go away somewhere, and get some fresh air to try to forget his experience. So he went to the station carrying his luggage and waited for a train to Greyport. As the train arrived, only one car seemed to have any places in it, but as he walked towards it, the head of the old man with no eyes suddenly appeared again at the window of the train. Harris felt sick. He ran to the next car and jumped into it just as the train started to move. The next thing he knew was that a woman and her daughter were kindly helping him to sit down. They seemed rather worried about him. Mrs. Carter and her daughter were also traveling to Greyport. They had an apartment there, and during the journey they invited Harris to stay with them. They soon became friends and spent a lot of time together. On the third evening of his stay, when Harris was telling them about his work at the library, the daughter suggested that Harris might be able to help them with a problem they had. "Yes," said her mother. "We'll tell Mr. Harris our story, and perhaps he'll be able to help us." "I'll certainly try," answered Harris. "Well," began Mrs. Carter, "I had an old uncle called Dr. Baker, and when he died, he left directions that we should put his body in a special underground room under a field near his house, and that he should wear his ordinary clothes. Since then, many of the country people around there say that they have seen him in his old gray coat. Anyway, he's been dead for 20 years now. He had no wife or family, just me, his niece, and my cousin Robert. He had a lot of money and a big house, and Robert and I hoped to receive half each when he died. But the day before he died, I was sitting near his bed when he suddenly opened his eyes and said, 'Alice, I've left everything to Robert in my will, you know. You won't get anything when I die.' This was a shock to me because my husband and I were not rich and we needed the money. But I said nothing because I felt that he wanted to say something more. I was right. He continued, 'But Alice, I don't like Robert and I think my will is wrong. I've decided that you should have everything, but first, you'll have to find the letter in which I have written my new will. And I'm not going to tell you where it is, but I will tell you one thing. I've left it in a book, Alice, and the book is not in this house. It's in a place where Robert can go and find it any time. So I'll tell you something more that Robert doesn't know. When I'm dead, you'll find an envelope in my desk with your name on it, and inside it you'll find something that will help you.' Well, a few hours later, he died, and I wrote to my cousin, Robert Wallace, but of course, he has never replied. Meanwhile, we have to continue living in our small apartment here at Greyport." "Did you say Robert Wallace?" asked Harris, amazed. "I saw a man called Robert Wallace just a few days ago, a thin, elderly man." "Yes, that sounds like him." "Where did you see him?" asked Mrs. Carter. "In a public place," said Harris. "I don't know if I should tell you where, but what about the envelope?" "Here it is," answered Mrs. Carter, and she took out a small piece of paper with just 5 numbers on it, 15567. Harris thought for a moment and then said, "Do you know what this number is?" "No," answered Mrs. Carter. "It's the number of a book," said Harris, "and I'll get it for you if you can be patient for just a little longer." The next day, Harris returned to the library and borrowed the ancient manuscript with the number 41567 on it. The book had been in that room for years and was very dusty. He turned it over in his hands, and as he did so, a piece of paper fell out of it. It was the letter which Dr. Baker had written, leaving all his money to his niece, Mrs. Carter. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share the video. See you next time.